Emma balanced a tray of plates on her arm, weaving between tables with the ease that came from years of practice. The small diner had been her second home for the past 4 years, ever since she dropped out of college to take care of her younger brother. The pay wasn't great, the hours were long, and the customers weren't always kind, but it was a job, and she needed it. She glanced toward the counter, where a woman sat staring down at her plate, barely touching her food. She was older, maybe in her late 50s, with tired eyes and a grief-stricken expression that made Emma pause. The woman had been there for nearly an hour, slowly picking at her meal, lost in thought. Emma approached with a soft smile. "Can I get you anything else?" The woman blinked up at her as if waking from a dream. "Oh no, thank you." Her voice was quiet, distant. "Just the check, please." Emma nodded and grabbed the bill from her apron pocket, placing it gently on the table. The woman barely glanced at it before reaching into her purse and pulling out a credit card. Emma took it to the register, swiped it, and frowned when the machine beeped. She tried again, declined. She walked back to the table, lowering her voice so no one else could hear. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but your card was declined." The woman's face drained of color. "That's not possible." She fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she pulled up her banking app. After a moment, she let out a shaky breath. "They blocked it. I forgot I made a large transfer this morning, and I guess they flagged it as suspicious." Emma could see the panic in her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she reached for her purse again, looking for cash she clearly didn't have. "It's okay," Emma said before she could start apologizing. "I've got it." The woman looked up in surprise. "No, I can't let you." Emma waved a hand dismissively. "It's just a meal, don't worry about it." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "You don't understand, I just lost my husband. This was supposed to be our place. We used to come here every Sunday." Her voice cracked and she wiped at her face. "I thought sitting here, having our usual meal, might make me feel close to him again." Emma's chest ached. She'd lost her parents in a car accident when she was just 19. She knew what grief felt like, how it sat in your chest like a weight that never fully went away. "I understand," she said softly. "Really." The woman swallowed hard and reached across the table, squeezing Emma's hand. "Thank you, I don't even know your name." "Emma," she replied with a small smile. The woman nodded. "I'm Margaret." Emma squeezed her hand back before stepping away. "I'll be right back." She quickly paid for the meal out of her own tip money, making sure Margaret didn't see. When she returned, Margaret was still sitting there, composing herself. "I'll call the bank as soon as I get home," Margaret said, her voice steadier now. "But I won't forget this, Emma." Emma just smiled. "Take care of yourself, okay?" Margaret nodded, gathering her things before heading toward the door. She paused before leaving, looking back at Emma one last time with an expression filled with something like gratitude. Then she was gone. Emma turned back to her duties, shaking off the encounter as just another moment in a long shift. She had no idea that small act of kindness would change her life forever. Emma didn't think much about Margaret after that night. Not because she didn't care, but because life had a way of pulling her in too many directions at once. Between double shifts at the diner and making sure her younger brother had everything he needed, there wasn't much room left for anything else. But 2 days later, Margaret walked back into the diner. Emma noticed her the moment she stepped inside. She was dressed a little nicer this time, wearing a pale blue blouse and neatly pressed slacks, but there was still a sadness in her eyes that hadn't gone away. Margaret scanned the room, her gaze landing on Emma almost immediately. She offered a small, hesitant smile before making her way to the same booth she'd sat in before. Emma grabbed a menu and approached. "Margaret," she greeted warmly, "it's nice to see you again." Margaret smiled, this time a little more genuine. "I was hoping you'd be here." Emma set the menu down, though she already knew Margaret wouldn't need it. the usual. Yes, please, Margaret let out a breath, as if gathering the courage to say what she really wanted. And I wanted to pay you back for the other night. She reached into her purse and pulled out a $20 bill, extending it toward Emma. Emma hesitated before taking it. You really didn't have to do that. Margaret shook her head. I wanted to, it meant a lot to me. She paused, glancing down at her hands. Losing my husband has been harder than I ever imagined. That night was the first time I'd been out to eat alone since he passed, and when my card got declined, I felt so helpless, embarrassed. She looked up at Emma with emotion in her eyes. But you didn't make me feel that way. You just helped without making a big deal out of it, and I can't tell you how much that meant. Emma's throat tightened. She wasn't used to people thanking her like this. Most of the time, kindness was something she gave without expecting anything in return. I'm really sorry about your husband, she said softly. I know how hard it is to lose someone. Margaret tilted her head. You do. Emma nodded. My parents died in a car accident when I was 19. It was sudden. One day they were there and the next. She exhaled. Everything changed. Margaret reached across the table and took Emma's hand in hers, squeezing gently. I'm so sorry. That must have been incredibly difficult. Emma swallowed, nodding. It was, still is sometimes. Margaret's eyes softened. You remind me of myself when I was younger, always putting others first. She let out a small chuckle, though there was sadness behind it. My husband, David, used to scold me for it. He'd always say, Margaret, you can't pour from an empty cup. But I never really listened. Emma smiled faintly. He sounds like he was a good man. He was, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. The best. Emma gave her hand one last squeeze before pulling away. I'll go put your order in. Margaret nodded, watching her go with a thoughtful expression. For the rest of the meal, they talked like old friends. Margaret told Emma stories about her husband, how they met, the little traditions they had, the way he always left her notes on the fridge just because. And Emma, in turn, shared bits and pieces of her own life, her struggles raising her younger brother, the long hours at the diner, the way she sometimes felt like she was barely keeping her head above water. By the time Margaret finished her meal, it felt like they had known each other for years, instead of just a few days. Before she left, Margaret reached into her purse again and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table to Emma. If you ever need anything, she said, please don't hesitate to call. Emma glanced down at the card. Margaret's full name was printed in elegant lettering at the top, Margaret Holloway. Below it, in smaller text, was her title. Emma's brow furrowed as she read it. Attorney at law. She looked up in surprise. You're a lawyer. Margaret smiled. Retired now, but yes, for nearly 30 years. Emma blinked. She hadn't expected that. Margaret stood, smoothing out her blouse. I won't keep you any longer, she said. But I meant it, Emma. If you ever need anything, call me. Emma tucked the card into her apron pocket. I will, thank you. Margaret gave her one last warm smile before walking out the door. Emma watched her go, feeling a strange sense of comfort settle in her chest. She had no idea that Margaret's promise wasn't just words. In a few days, her life was about to change in ways she never could have imagined. Emma's shifts at the diner continued as usual, though something felt different since her conversations with Margaret. There was a warmth in knowing that someone had taken the time to listen to her, to truly see her. She wasn't used to that. Most of the time, she was just another waitress in an apron, blending into the background as customers came and went. A few days later, just as she was finishing up a long shift, Margaret returned. This time, she wasn't alone. A tall man in his mid-40s walked beside her, dressed in a sharp navy suit, exuding quiet confidence. His polished appearance made him stand out in the small, homey diner. Margaret smiled when she saw Emma, waving her over as she slid into her usual booth. The man sat across from her, his expression unreadable. Emma approached, wiping her hands on her apron. "Margaret, it's good to see you again." Margaret reached for Emma's hand briefly, squeezing it. "It's good to see you too, dear." She gestured toward the man. "This is my nephew, James Holloway." James extended his hand, and Emma shook it hesitantly. His grip was firm but not intimidating. "It's nice to meet you," Emma said, glancing between them, a hint of curiosity in her voice. Margaret's expression softened. "Emma, I wanted to introduce you to James because I've been thinking a lot about what you did for me that night, and I told him about it." Emma shifted slightly, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "You didn't have to do that." Margaret gave her a knowing smile. "I wanted to," she glanced at James. "Go on, tell her." James cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "Margaret speaks very highly of you, Emma. She told me about your kindness, how you helped her without hesitation, despite your own struggles." He paused, studying her. "She also mentioned that you've been working here for years, taking care of your younger brother, putting your own dreams on hold." Emma blinked, caught off guard. She had never spoken to Margaret about her dreams, not directly. But maybe Margaret had picked up on it in their conversations. James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black envelope. He placed it on the table in front of her. Emma stared at it. "What's this?" Margaret smiled gently. "Something we hope will help you." Emma hesitated, then slowly reached for the envelope. She opened it carefully, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled out a check. The moment her eyes landed on the amount, she froze. $10,000. Her breath caught in her throat. I can't accept this." Margaret reached across the table, resting her hand on Emma's. "Yes, you can, and you should." Emma shook her head, still staring at the check. "This is too much." James spoke then, his voice steady. "Margaret wanted to do something meaningful to thank you, and I agreed. You helped her when she was at one of the lowest points in her life, not because you had to, but because you cared. There aren't enough people like you in the world, Emma." Emma swallowed hard, emotion rising in her chest. But why this much? Margaret sighed softly. "Because I know how hard it is to struggle, to put your life on hold for someone else, and because I can. I spent years as a lawyer, built a life with my husband, and now I have the means to help someone who deserves it." She smiled. "And I think you do." Emma felt tears sting her eyes. She wanted to refuse again, to insist that she couldn't possibly accept something so generous. But the truth was, she needed this. She had been barely scraping by, always one unexpected expense away from disaster. Margaret squeezed her hand. "Please, Emma, let me do this for you." Emma exhaled sharply, her resistance crumbling. She looked back at Margaret, then at James, both of them watching her with nothing but kindness in their eyes. Slowly she nodded. "Thank you, I don't even know what to say." Margaret smiled warmly. "Just say you'll use it to make your life a little easier." Emma held the check tightly in her hands, her heart full. She had started that night expecting nothing, just another long shift at the diner. But somehow, her small act of kindness had led her here, with an unexpected gift that could change everything. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, good things could happen to her too. Emma sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the check in her hands. The numbers still didn't seem real. $10,000. It was more money than she had ever held at one time. More money than she had ever thought she'd have control over. Her younger brother, Ryan, sat across from her, his eyes darting between her and the check. "Are you sure this isn't a scam?" he asked, half joking, half serious. Emma let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "It's not a scam. Margaret and her nephew gave it to me. They wanted to help." Ryan leaned back in his chair, whistling under his breath. "That's insane. What are you gonna do with it?" That was the question, wasn't it? Emma had spent so many years scraping by, worrying about rent, utilities, groceries. There had never been enough to think about anything beyond survival. Now, for the first time, she had the chance to breathe. She exhaled slowly. I don't know, but I do know one thing: I'm going to use it wisely. Ryan nodded, trusting her judgment. He was only 17, still in high school, but he had seen firsthand how hard Emma worked to keep them afloat. If anyone deserved this, it was her. The next day, Emma made a plan. She paid off the overdue bills that had been piling up, the ones she had been too afraid to open. She set aside money for rent, making sure they were secure for the next few months. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to think about her future. That afternoon, she found herself dialing a number she had tucked away in her apron pocket. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Emma. Emma smiled. Hi, Margaret. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. Not at all, dear. How are you? Emma hesitated, finding it hard to put everything into words. I just wanted to say thank you again. I don't think you realize how much this means to me. Margaret's voice softened. Oh, I think I do. Emma bit her lip, gathering her thoughts. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about not putting my life on hold forever. And I want to go back to school. The words felt surreal even as she said them. I don't know if I'll be able to do it full time, but I want to take classes, maybe finish my degree. I don't want to be a waitress forever. There was a brief pause on the other end, then Margaret spoke, her voice full of warmth. That's wonderful, Emma. What were you studying before? Business, Emma admitted. I had to drop out after my parents died, but I always wanted to go back. Margaret hummed in thought. That's a smart choice. And you're right, you shouldn't be a waitress forever, not if you don't want to be. Emma felt a rush of emotion. Margaret had only been in her life for a short time, but somehow she had become one of the few people who truly believed in her. Margaret hesitated for a moment before speaking again. Emma, I have a proposition for you. Emma straightened in her chair. What is it? I told you before that I was a lawyer for many years, Margaret said. Well, I didn't just work for myself. I had a firm, a successful one. When I retired, my nephew James took over most of my responsibilities, but I still have connections. Emma listened intently, unsure where this was going. I know you're planning to go back to school, but in the meantime, I'd like to offer you a job, Margaret continued. It wouldn't be anything too complicated, an assistant position at my old firm. Flexible hours, good pay, and the chance to learn a few things firsthand about business and law. Emma's breath hitched. A real job, a way out of the diner, a future. Margaret, I don't know what to say. Margaret chuckled. Say yes. Emma let out a breathless laugh, tears prickling at her eyes. Yes, absolutely yes. Margaret's voice was warm. Good, I'll have James call you with the details. After they hung up, Emma sat in stunned silence. Not only had Margaret given her financial security, but now she was offering her a way forward, a chance to build something better. For the first time in years, Emma wasn't just surviving. She was moving forward. Emma walked into the office building, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. She had never worked in an office before, never worn business attire or sat at a desk answering phones. But as she stepped into the lobby and saw Margaret waiting for her with a warm smile, she knew she had made the right decision. Margaret stood, smoothing out her blouse as Emma approached. You look wonderful, dear, she said, taking in Emma's neatly pressed slacks and button-up blouse. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was a step up from the diner uniform she had worn for years. Emma smiled, clutching her purse tightly. I'm a little nervous. Margaret chuckled. That's perfectly normal, but you'll do just fine. James appeared a moment later, his usual composed expression softening when he saw Emma. "Good morning," he greeted. "Ready for your first day?" Emma exhaled, nodding. "As ready as I'll ever be." James led her through the office, introducing her to various employees. The office itself was sleek and professional, filled with people who moved with purpose. Emma felt out of place at first, but as she settled into her desk, she reminded herself of why she was here. This was a fresh start, a chance to build something better. The first few days were overwhelming, filled with training and new responsibilities. She learned how to answer phones professionally, how to organize legal documents, and how to handle appointments. It was a completely different world from the diner, but she found herself enjoying the challenge. Margaret checked in on her often, offering encouragement and advice. Emma appreciated her presence more than she could say. It was comforting to know she had someone in her corner, someone who believed in her. One afternoon, as she was organizing files, Margaret stopped by her desk. "How are you settling in?" she asked, leaning against the desk. Emma smiled. "Better than I expected. It's a lot to learn, but I like it." Margaret nodded approvingly. "I had a feeling you would. You're a fast learner, Emma." Emma hesitated before speaking. "I've been looking into classes at the local college. I think I can start part-time next semester." Margaret's face lit up. "That's wonderful news." Emma exhaled, still feeling the weight of the decision. "It's scary, though, going back after all these years." Margaret reached for Emma's hand, squeezing it gently. "You're going to do great things, I have no doubt about that." Emma felt a lump rise in her throat. It had been so long since anyone had believed in her the way Margaret did. As the weeks passed, Emma grew more confident in her role. She still had a lot to learn, but she no longer felt out of place. She had a steady paycheck, a secure home, and a future that felt bright for the first time in years. One evening, as she was leaving the office, she found Margaret waiting for her outside. "Walk with me," Margaret asked. Emma nodded, falling into step beside her. They strolled down the quiet street, the city lights glowing softly around them. After a moment, Margaret spoke. "You know, when I lost my husband, I felt lost," she admitted, "like a part of me was missing." Emma listened intently, knowing how much those words carried. "But meeting you reminded me that life goes on," Margaret continued, glancing at Emma. "That kindness has a way of coming back to us. You helped me that night, and now I get to see you build the life you deserve." Emma swallowed hard, emotions swelling in her chest. "I don't know how to thank you." Margaret smiled, squeezing Emma's arm. "Just promise me you'll keep moving forward." Emma nodded, determination settling in her heart. She would. And for the first time in a long time, she truly believed that good things were ahead.